Welcome, everyone. Good morning to some, good afternoon to others. We're very pleased to have such a great turnout for this webinar on understanding household and school proprietor needs in low-fee private schools in Ghana. My name is Arjun Upadhyay. I'm a senior program associate at Results for Development Institute and one of four presenters today. I'm here with my colleague Robert Francis, also from R4D, and a key contributor to the report. Alison Rohner, Executive Director of the IDP Rising Schools Program, and Irene Pritzker, Founder and President of the IDP Foundation. Alison, Robert, and I will take turns presenting the research during the first segment of the webinar. After the presentation, which will run for about 40 minutes, we will have time for questions and answers, where we'll ask Irene to join us and answer any IDP Foundation specific questions we might receive. So before we begin, I would just like to explain one house rule. For the Q&A segment, we ask you to type in your questions in the chat box feature of the webinar at any time during the presentation. My colleague Duncan will collect and organize your questions for us to answer. So I hope that is clear to everyone. And with that, let us begin. The agenda for today's webinar is the following. We will begin by providing some context and rationale behind the study. Alison will describe the IDP Rising Schools program and why the IDP Foundation sought to commission the study. A description of the methodology and the education system in Ghana will follow. We will then present the report findings, first on the needs assessment and then the impact assessment, and then finish off by presenting conclusions and recommendations. So with that, I'll hand it over to Alison to describe the IDP Rising Schools program and rationale for commissioning this research. Over to you, Alison.
Thank you, Arjun, and hello, everyone. So a bit of background on the IDP Foundation and the Rising Schools program. In September 2009, the IDP Foundation partnered with Sinapiaba, a local Ghanaian microfinance institution. And we created the IDP Rising Schools program to support individuals that were complementing the efforts of the government by establishing schools in low-income communities. With an estimated 6,000 low-fee private schools in Ghana at that time, the program was developed in response to the clear market demand for an intervention that addressed the needs of this rapidly growing sector. The IDP Rising Schools program was created to reach those at the base of the economic pyramid, so schools charging an initial average tuition of around $15 per term for participating schools. The program offers proprietors the necessary tools to prioritize for the future and create a stable learning environment. It has shown that extensive training in financial literacy and school management, accompanied by business loans, will enable schools to reach their goals. Topics covered in the training include accounting, savings, handling credit, human resources management, community relations, registration as a business, and very importantly, registration with the Ghana Education Service. After 3 years of demonstrated success during our pilot, which consisted of 105 existing primary schools that reached 27,000 children, the program is fully developed and expanding throughout Ghana. After participating in the program, proprietors have markedly improved their school's physical stability, their school management skills, and their ability to successfully manage their finances. Among the program's many achievements, a few to highlight are that 557 school proprietors have been trained in the Rising Schools program, and that's reaching over 130,000 children. We've dispersed 380 loans in the amount of 5 million Ghanaian cedis and have a repayment rate of 93%. And on top of that, we see that about 40% of proprietors take multiple loans. So we commissioned this work because as we see that the program is continuing to scale and we're confident that our model with training is allowing financial institutions to lend to low-fee private schools with great success. But we recognize that our work is just beginning and that it's time to revisit our schools to get a better understanding on how to help them move forward, as well as how to support other social enterprises addressing quality of education issues. So the objectives for us were threefold. First, we wanted to evaluate the needs of low-fee private school proprietors and heads of households and examine what key stakeholders demand in terms of education, quality improvement services, and also what they can afford to pay for such services. This will help to inform the efforts of the foundation in promoting the development of a robust market of social enterprises addressing those needs. Second, we wanted to understand the impact the IDP Rising Schools program has had. We wanted to collect follow-up data on schools that have participated in the IDP Rising Schools program and understand what has changed in those schools since entering. And kind of alongside both of those, we wanted to make sure we were contributing to empirical data to what has often been a very ideologically charged debate about what the role of low-fee private schools can play in complementing government provision of education. In doing so, we aim to identify ways in which a variety of education stakeholders can support this sector to improve access to quality education in Ghana. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Arjun.
Great. Thanks so much, Allison. So as Allison just mentioned, R4D as researchers had two main objectives. First, it was to understand the impact of the IDP Rising Schools program, and second, to assess the needs of low-fee private schools and understand households' perception of quality education. In addressing these two objectives, this study was able to fill in some gaps in the literature on low-fee private schools, and was able to, one, analyze the priorities, strategies, and motivation of school proprietors, two, better understand school finances, and three, explore whether these schools are actually affordable to low-income households. To answer the two research objectives, this study employed a mixed methods approach that included desk research and primary data collection in 5 regions: Ashanti, Brong-Ahafo, Greater Accra, Upper East, and Western. Our research began with a desk review of literature to understand current debate topics at the global and Ghanaian contexts. We estimated the impact of the IDP Rising Schools program by using a pre-post comparison of baseline data and the midline data that we collected. Importantly, a total of 150 schools and nearly 2,000 households were surveyed as part of our research. This represents a significant dataset which allowed us to analyze both the supply and demand sides of the low-fee private school market. Expert interviews were also conducted in Ghana with officers from the government, development agencies, researchers, and others. Finally, the report was written and managed by R4D with key support from Consumer Insight Consult, a market assessment firm based in Ghana, and guidance from the IDP Foundation. So before we present our findings, we thought it would be important to understand why the number of low-fee private schools have grown in the first place. The recent growth in low-fee private schools has mirrored the overall increase in access to education in Ghana. Driven by population growth, economic growth, and changes in government policy, primary enrollment nearly doubled between 2000 and 2011. Net enrollment rates of kindergarten and primary school have risen rapidly, and the number of out-of-school children for those same grade levels have decreased since 2010, as seen in Figure 1. Despite this growth, significant inequalities remain. Poor households still have trouble accessing education. The net enrollment rate of the richest quintile is 24% higher than the poorest. Location is also a considerable factor, as attendance rate in urban areas are higher than rural areas, and northern regions have lower education outcomes than southern ones, as seen in Figure 2. The lack of access to quality education is one reason why enrollment in the private sector is growing. Private schools offer an alternative option for parents. The number of private primary schools have increased by more than 46% between 2009 and 2015, compared to 4% growth in the government schools. Although these exact numbers are difficult to verify, it is estimated that 40% of those private schools are considered low fee. And the spectacular growth has come despite harsh operating conditions, where schools are heavily taxed yet receive no real government support. It's not surprising that the rise in low-fee private schools has sparked academic and research interest. A review of global and Ghana-specific literature revealed several prominent themes. One of the most important themes in the literature is that of quality. Global, global literature supports the notion that the private sector delivers high-quality education. When compared to government schools, low-fee private schools achieve better educational outcomes. In Ghana, however, the literature is a little bit more nuanced. Research suggests that parents perceive low-fee private schools to offer higher quality education, although those perceptions are commonly based on the performance outcomes of advantaged private schools, or private schools that wouldn't be considered low-fee. In addition, literature describes greater efficiency, accountability, and lower operating costs in low-fee private schools. Households choose these schools because they are often closer, seem to yield higher test scores, and because teachers are less likely to be absent. We thought these would be important to highlight before we present our findings, as these themes have guided much of our research. So what did we find? We begin the findings section by showcasing the basic profiles of a typical school included in our sample. As you can see, there's a diverse range of school types, where differences in enrollment rates, teacher salaries, and tuition fees are often due to location, either regional or between the urban-rural divide. One of the main findings of our research was that for almost all schools, improving infrastructure was consistently cited as their greatest need. 44% say infrastructure is the school's biggest challenge, and 75% say improved infrastructure is either the top priority or an area they want to invest in. Infrastructure is weakest in schools that are rural, unregistered, or located in the Upper East. And these infrastructure challenges include the lack of proper classrooms, school walls that are unfinished windows or roofs. And for some schools, like in the photo in the bottom right, classrooms can sometimes spill outdoors. Following infrastructure needs, our research revealed that the financial situation is often precarious for most of these schools. 88% of schools do not have the necessary resources to finance school improvement projects, and only one-third of schools are profitable. 42% operate at a loss or do not know their exact financial standing. We also noticed that revenue streams in these schools are not diversified. Tuition and canteen fees account for nearly 84% of all revenue. Importantly, this study disputes the notion that proprietors are ruthless business owners for whom profit margins undermine academic achievement. Despite these challenges of poor infrastructure and financial constraints, we noticed that low-fee private schools are surprisingly resilient and have been able to get by being flexible. The average age of schools in our sample is 14 years, and we discovered that proprietors adopted flexible strategies to overcome financial challenges. This included 1. Introducing flexible school fees, 2. Gradually investing in infrastructure, and 3. Hiring inexperienced teachers and training them internally. We will then go through each one of these strategies in the next few slides. Many low-fee private schools offer flexible payment schemes either by introducing daily fees or sometimes accepting advance or delayed payments. Offering flexible fee payment structures is recognition that proprietors understand the unsteady nature of parent incomes. Ultimately, flexible payment options limit the number of permanent dropouts due to irregular household finances, thus allowing schools to maintain a relatively predictable flow of income. In the demand side, many families are attracted to schools that offer flexible payments because it does not require them to have saved up large sums of money for tuition. This also makes it easier for families with multiple children to send other children to school as well. We also found that low-fee private schools are more inclined to finance gradual, piecemeal infrastructure projects given their financial constraints. This gradual approach represents a sensible ad hoc strategy that utilizes additional revenue during profitable years to finance projects. When we visited low-fee private schools, it was common for us to notice partially constructed classrooms, walls, and compounds, which are clear indicators that the infrastructure has been developed in distinct stages. Moreover, 1 in 5 low-fee private schools reported having either partial resources available or having started but stalled their infrastructure development projects. Like most rational and financially constrained entities, low-fee private schools will inherently invest in segments, often during periods when business is strong, and stall investments when it is weak. The report also finds that low-fee private schools have been able to maximize inherent market incentives and use an operating model where they can hire low-wage teachers and provide them with in-service training without ultimately jeopardizing household satisfaction with teacher and school academic performance. Our study found that the average monthly salary in our surveyed schools is around 140 Ghanaian cedis. The difference is striking when compared to government teachers, where the average monthly salary is reported to be 1,300 cedis. Although low-fee private schools are able to keep teacher compensation low, this does not mean that teacher quality is an afterthought. While low-fee private schools generally hire teachers with fewer qualifications and less experience than those hired by government schools, 91% of schools reported having teacher guidelines. 87% provided pre-service training, and 82% provide in-service training. Contrary to common perception, nearly 72% of low-fee private schools who provide teacher training manage to do so internally. And low wages does not seem to have impacted household perception of teachers. Households not only view teacher quality as a top determinant of school quality, they are also very satisfied with the performance of current teachers. As seen in Figure 8, parents are most satisfied with teachers and least satisfied with school facilities. I will now hand it over to Robert, who will present findings from the household survey and impact assessment.
Great, thanks, Arjun. Like you said, from here we'll be moving on to discuss findings regarding households where children attend selected low-fee private schools. I'd like to begin with a brief reminder of who's included in the study sample. We interviewed members of 1,950 households where at least one child attended a low-fee private school. 1,430 households had children attending an IDP Rising School Program school, and the remaining 520 households had children attending a comparable non-program school. Our first task was to determine how the selected households compared to the overall population of Ghana. To do this, we used the Progress Out of Poverty Index, or PPI. The PPI measures the poverty likelihood of a household or a population using a 10-question assessment. The assessment includes questions about asset ownership, demographics, and education, and can accurately represent the proportion of a population living below a certain daily rate of consumption. This survey was carried out for the population of Ghana in 2014. Because it's tied to assets, the rate of change over time is slow, meaning that it can be reliably compared to our sample from earlier this year. The average PPI score for Ghana is 52.5, indicating that 23% of Ghana's population lives below $2.50 per day. The average PPI score from our sample was significantly higher at 64, indicating that only 9% of the sample lives below $2.50 per day. The graph on the right compares the distribution of LFPS attending households to those of Ghana at large, which shows that households which send children to low-fee private schools have higher living standards than the average household in Ghana. Additionally, only 22.4% of LFPS enrollment is drawn from the 25% of Ghana's population with the lowest living standards. This suggests that LFPS are inaccessible to the poorest Ghanaian households. This does not mean, however, that education costs are trivial to those attending LFPS. Using household income and education expenditure figures, we calculated the proportion of income spent by each household on education. On average, the sampled household spends 8.2% of yearly income on education, but this varies considerably between the lowest and highest income quintiles of the sample. Households in the lowest income quintile spend on average 18% of their income on education, compared to just 2.7% for the highest income quintile. This difference is largely attributable to differences in income, not differences in education expenditure. The lowest income quintile spends on average 191 cedis per year per child on education, compared to 221 cedis for the highest income quintile. Within the sample, there is very low elasticity of education spending with respect to income. This is only a 22% increase in spending between the bottom and top income quintiles. In addition, a large proportion of households spend more than is considered affordable on education. James Tooley and other experts argue that education expenses are affordable if the total expenditure on all children is less than 10% of household income. 27% of households surveyed do not meet this threshold. In fact, in the bottom income quintile, households spend on average 10% of their income to educate one child. And how do households respond to the financial strain caused by education costs? This study paints a fairly limited picture of the household response because we didn't find or interview households that had withdrawn their children from selected schools. We only interviewed members of households with children currently attending the sampled schools. That being said, the data paint an interesting picture. We found that it is very rare for households who have a child enrolled in a low-fee private school to have other school-aged children out of school. Only about 1% of sampled households have school-aged out-of-school children. It seems very unlikely that parents forego educating one child in favor of another. Instead, it's common for children to sometimes miss school when the household has a shortage of funds and parents are unable to pay for tuition or feeding fees for a short period. This is true for 27% of households. Although they remain enrolled in school, the education of many children is disrupted because of a temporary shortage of funds. This seems to indicate that flexible fees have advantages and disadvantages. While flexible fees mean that caregivers don't need to save up large sums of money to pay for tuition, they instead pay day by day, which is more in line with their regular incomes and cash flows, it means that any shortage of funds will translate into an interruption of a child's education. Before we dive into a discussion of our findings regarding the impact of the IDP Rising Schools program on the selected schools, I'd like to make a brief methodological note. As this study didn't use randomized assignment of treatment, differences between program and non-program schools may be attributable to selection bias or other exogenous factors, and are not solely a function of participation in the Rising Schools program. Notwithstanding, there are still very important lessons that can be learned about the IDP RSP's impact from qualitative and quantitative data. The first of these lessons is that the most useful element of IDP Rising Schools program training to proprietors was financial accounting and bookkeeping. As Allison said, the program's 9-week training course covers topics ranging from school and business registration and fee collection to human resource management, publicity, teacher training, and enforcement discipline. Of all of these elements, proprietors were most likely, by a very wide margin, to identify financial accounting and bookkeeping as the elements they gained the most from. Nearly half of all participating proprietors identified this as the most useful concept learned. Relatedly, proprietors were asked what changed as a result of training. 37% cited an improvement in the school's financial management, which again was the most commonly cited change. 11% cited school management, and 11% also cited improved teaching. There's reason to believe that improved financial accounting and bookkeeping improve a school's financial outcomes. Regression analysis showed that bookkeeping is positively correlated with school profitability. Schools that kept more financial records, including accounts receivable, accounts payable, and petty cash books, were also more likely to be profitable than schools that kept fewer financial books. Acknowledging the potential role of selection bias, there is evidence that suggests that the Rising Schools program promotes profitability by encouraging record keeping. As a final note on training, a number of program schools were also included in training sessions designed by Sesame Workshop. Teachers from these schools received instruction on topics such as classroom management, pupil-centered learning, time management, and differentiated instruction. Of the 37 schools that participated in the Sesame Workshop, only 2 schools reported not currently making use of the learned aptitudes. Next, let's continue the discussion of profitability. The graph here shows the distribution of school profitability among schools that didn't participate in the Rising Schools program, schools that received training, and schools that received both loans and training. As Arjun already observed, profitability is relatively rare among these schools. While non-program schools seem to be evenly distributed in the 4 categories, IDP-RSP schools are more likely to be profitable than non-IDP schools. This is even true for schools that did not receive loans and only received training. Training alone correlates with improved profitability. This is evident in the graph, but was also confirmed using ordered logit regressions. Program schools also took in more revenue than non-program schools. Again, given the possibility of selection bias, this isn't proof that the IDP Rising Schools program makes schools more profitable, but it is certainly suggestive. Finally, we found that the provision of loans helped sampled schools make needed improvements. Schools most frequently used loans to improve infrastructure or add classrooms, although there were schools that used loans to acquire a school bus or the land where the school was located. Of the 110 supported schools included in this study, 61 received loans and training, while 49 only received training and did not receive a loan. The lower table on this slide goes into the reasons for which schools did not receive loans. Many of the schools did not receive loans because of financial need. The interest rate was too high, they had insufficient resources, or didn't meet SINAPI APA requirements. It's important to note that the schools that participated in the program but did not receive loans, in other words, the schools that only received training, seem to also have greater need for financing. These schools had 18% more students per toilet, and their student bodies had lower average household incomes by 19% compared with schools that did not receive loans. This is somewhat confirmed by their reasons given for not receiving loans. Many didn't meet SINAPI APA requirements or didn't have the means to take a loan out. While the loans doubtlessly improved the conditions for schools that received them, they didn't reach many of the schools that were perhaps in the greatest need of financing. To this point, we've discussed the challenges and needs facing low-fee private schools, findings related to household financing of education, and findings regarding the impact of the IDP Rising Schools program on schools. Before moving on to our recommendations and the questions and answer segment, we'd like to summarize 5 high-level findings that have emerged from the research. First, we found that most schools are either breaking even, suffering a loss, or do not know their financial status. This disputes the notion that low-fee private schools that these schools exist to turn profits for proprietors. To the contrary, many operate at a loss. But despite the financial constraints, these schools are financially resilient because of their ability to keep costs low and adopt flexible financing. Second, school proprietors consistently cited poor infrastructure as being the greatest challenge faced by their schools. Infrastructure is also the component of schools that parents are least satisfied with. Third, there is evidence that proprietors understand the importance of teaching quality as an input to high academic performance. Over 80% of proprietors surveyed invest in teacher training, and proprietors believe that parents choose their schools because of their high academic standard. From the household side, parent satisfaction with teacher quality and the academic performance of schools is relatively high. Fourth, sampled schools generally do not reach the poorest segments of the Ghanaian population. Conversely, Households with children who attend low-fee private schools generally have a higher standard of living than the average New England household. Fifth, the IDP Rising Schools program improves the financial stability of low-fee private schools through training on financial management and provision of loans. There is evidence that the program has helped proprietors improve bookkeeping and has also encouraged them to save in order to invest in future projects. Participating schools are also more likely to be profitable than comparable non-participating schools. And finally, on a broader level, we recognize that the low-fee private school sector faces significant difficulties. However, in spite of the ongoing challenges, we feel that low-fee private schools have an important role in complementing government efforts to provide access to quality education. We hope that the findings we presented here will help inform efforts to make quality education affordable, equitable, and sustainable. From here, Arjun will discuss recommendations that proceed from our findings.
Great. Thanks so much, Robert. So what does this all mean, and where do we go from here? So as Robert mentioned, our study reinforces the importance of low-fee private schools, highlighting that private schools are viewed by families as providing high-quality education and as positioning their children for future success. Nevertheless, more can be done. The recommendations that follow offer guidance on how donors, foundations, and stakeholders can support the provision of high-quality education in low-fee private schools. Our recommendation 1 is to first expand data collection and analysis. The availability of quality data on low-fee private schools is low. As a result, those that support low-fee private schools should strive to routinely collect, analyze, and publish program data on access, affordability, finance, and most importantly, quality. The collection of longitudinal data would be particularly beneficial as it would allow for an analysis of trends over time, bring attention to the topic of low-fee private schools, and most importantly, serve as a global public good. Recommendation 2 is to continue offering loans for infrastructure and provide additional support to improve teacher quality. As mentioned, households express relative dissatisfaction with the current state of infrastructure in schools. This need is also recognized by proprietors who lack access to financing for those improvements. Loans from the IDP Rising Schools program provide access to new financing, and 32 of the 110 interviewed proprietors attribute improvements in general school infrastructure to those loans. Given their effectiveness and the needs expressed by proprietors, the IDP Foundation and other similar donors should consider expanding low-fee private schools' access to microloans for infrastructure development projects. The IDP Rising Schools program has focused primarily on improving access to education by helping proprietors improve infrastructure and financial and operational management of schools. While parents are generally satisfied with the caliber of teaching, concerted efforts to improve teacher quality could serve as a natural next step for IDP Rising Schools program and other low-fee private school stakeholders. An increased focus on teacher quality was also advocated by education experts interviewed in Ghana. Recommendation 3 is to support the development of policies to better integrate government and private education services, primarily through a heightened role in advocacy and sharing of good practices. The IDP Rising Schools program and other similar donors could play a significant role of knowledge broker by highlighting successful models or operational modalities found in low-fee private schools and sharing them with private and public sector stakeholders. The sharing of good practices and successes could fill a general lack of knowledge in this sector and could inform the development of clear standards on teacher-pupil ratios, infrastructure, sanitation, school grounds, and others. Given our findings, it seems unlikely that the poorest households will be able to afford low-fee private schools without some kind of financial assistance. Supporters of this school sector could explore the introduction of public-private partnerships, such as voucher programs or contract schools, in order to lower these education costs. Donors could also advocate for PPPs in the form of subsidies for teacher secondments, provision of free teaching and learning materials, a free attendance to government teacher training, and supportive supervision by education officers are just some other examples of potential public-private partnerships. So with that, it wraps up our presentation section of the webinar, and I'll now turn over to Duncan, who has been busy organizing your questions and will pose them to us shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arjun. And also thank you very much to Robert Francis and Allison Rohner for distilling so many of the findings of the report into this discussion. I think following along with Arjun's closing remarks about the implications of this research for next steps in this critical topic of low-fee private schools, we have a couple attendees asking more specifically about what's next for the IDP Rising Schools program. And Irene, I think that now might be a great time for you to shed a little light on what's next for the IDP Rising Schools program.
Yes, I'm very happy to. Now that the program has proven to be sustainable, scalable, and replicable, we want to replicate that. And so we have partnered with an organization to explore the next country that we will move our program to. And currently we're looking at Kenya, Nigeria, or Pakistan. But it's a question of finding exactly the right financial partner to work with. The other thing that we have done is we've signed a memorandum of understanding with the Ghana Education Service, which demonstrates our shared commitment to ensuring that all children in Ghana have access to quality education and that the most marginalized are indeed included. So the MOU is a commitment to support Ghana Education Services in training teachers that have participated in the Rising Schools program. And to that end, we're continuing our partnership with Sesame Workshop, with whom we gave a grant much earlier to something that we called our Techniques for Effective Teaching project, which consisted of 10 teaching modules that promoted child-centered active learning and teaching in the classroom, much more creatively based. So we're adding additional videos and extending to train approximately 200 low-resource private schools that have been part of the IDP Rising Schools program. And so that's what is immediately in store for us.
Great, thank you for sharing, Irene. A follow-up along those lines, especially in regards to the MOU that you referenced with the Ghanaian government, is a question from one of our attendees about possible public-private partnerships. So if you could speak to your experience with the IDP Rising Schools program with that, I think that would be really helpful as well.
Well, one of the things that we've been really careful to do since the inception or when we were trying to sort out the program to begin with is to make sure that we worked very closely with the government of Ghana. And actually, I think that's hugely important because there are an awful lot of philanthropic efforts and various undertakings in the field of education where people will go into a country and the government has no idea that they're there, what they're doing, it's not coordinated. So one of the things that we have really found to be a great frustration to the government is most of these schools are just not registered with the government. So they're not on their radar. So one of the key topics of training is to teach the low-fee private schools to register with the Ghana Education Service and discuss and really emphasize the importance of engaging with the government, following their regulations, and understanding that that's really and truly in the best interest of themselves and also of the children they serve. We have, in turn, done a tremendous amount to inform the government the actual reality about the existence of those low-fee private schools. There's been the perception that they make that they're money gouging, that they're profiteering off the very poor. And we have shown, particularly in this Results for Development report, that only about 33% of the schools reported being profitable in the last academic year. About 25% broke even and about 17% reported a loss. And 24%, unfortunately, reported not knowing their financial standing, really. So I think that the Ministry of Education and the Ghana Education Services are being responsible for both public and private schools, but due to budget limitations, due to strong teacher unions, a lack of capacity, they've been focusing their energies on improving the government schools. And because of the way that we work with them, they do appreciate that we are doing something to complement their efforts and help the private schools, these bottom of the pyramid private schools, to improve. Given their limitations, they're not actively exploring PPPs, but we're co-hosting a Ghana Evidence in Education Summit, and that's going to seriously involve the Ministry of Education and includes a half-day workshop to discuss tangible actions to better include the low-fee private schools in the overall education system and in education policy in Ghana. So this will be a great opportunity to gauge the temperature of the government towards public-private partnerships and to see if they're interested in exploring them as an option to improve education in the system. It's a lot cheaper to subsidize a school than to build a whole new one and to deal with strong unions. So we'll listen to the key stakeholders in the room, most importantly the government, and see what they seek from and for this sector.
Thank you very much, Irene. There's some really exciting next steps there. We're getting another question, or a series of questions actually, from participants around this really important topic of teachers. And for example, one participant is asking if the lower compensation rates that you mentioned are having an effect on turnover, and others are asking about the connection between lower compensation and the quality of teacher performance. And I was hoping, Robert, would you be able to shed some light on these issues?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Duncan. That is a really important question. So first, to address the issue of teacher turnover and how that's affected by the low wages. We asked the proprietors of these schools if they had had any teachers resign over the last year, and about 2/3 of schools had teacher resignations over the past year, and they averaged about 2.5 teachers per school. So there is some turnover going on, but we asked the proprietors the reasons for the teacher resignations, and surprisingly, the top reason, by a wide margin, was for the teachers to pursue further education. Proprietors reported that 67% of the teachers that resigned were leaving to pursue further education, as compared to just 9% for because of the low salary. So this isn't something that we expected to find, but it looks like the teachers aren't driven away because of the low salaries. Additionally, proprietors report that they don't really have issues obtaining enough teachers to teach in their schools. They're a little more concerned about improving the quality of their teachers. And looking at performance of these teachers, as we've noted, about 80% of proprietors provide pre-service and in-service training for their teachers. So they are making efforts to train and improve the quality of their teachers. And while we don't have measures of student outcomes to see the quality of the teaching, we can look at parental satisfaction. And across the board, we find that parents are quite satisfied with the quality of teachers.
Great, thank you for answering those questions, Robert. Taking a step back, we have a couple questions thinking about this topic in light of the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals through 2030, where vast majority of nations have committed to providing quality lifelong learning opportunities for everyone. Irene, I think this might be a good opportunity for you to jump back in and speak a little bit about the kind of broader context here and how our research and how your upcoming work fits into that context of the SDGs and this new commitment to not only access but quality lifelong learning opportunities for all.
Okay, sure, I'd be happy to. Well, you know, when we began our program, there were no SDGs, but as they were released last year at the UN General Assembly, and we have been examining very much how our work intersects with the SDG goals and targets. What we actually discovered was that we don't only intersect with the education goal, but we intersect at SDGs 1, 4, 5, 8, and 17. And that isn't to say that each target is carried out in totality, because, you know, there are so many targets. But we certainly have discovered that we do intersect at several of the goals and targets. The results for development report is very important in this regard, because going forward, philanthropy and in fact all work in the developing world is increasingly going to be measured within the SDG framework. We're seeing this everywhere in the impact investing space. We're seeing it in education. We're seeing it in the way corporations are being encouraged to operate within countries. And so then when we take a look at the R4D report, we see where we can strengthen our program considerably based on the answers given by households and parents, and looking at where the Ghanaian SDG platform is placing its emphases, and seeing where these schools are not either meeting expectations or not properly emphasizing the correct ones. So we think that the SDGs are a great starting point to measure progress in education. But of course, education is very complex and solutions are not a one-size-fits-all, because there are such varying cultural contexts. Currently, we're working with the United Nations Development Program SDG Philanthropy Platform in Ghana to increase the impact at the country level. We're doing this through collaboration and local partnerships with the government, development partners, and social enterprises. And this is designed to try to channel philanthropy into a more cohesive and collaborative effort within a country.
Great, thank you, Irene. Well, that's certainly an important goal, and I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on that with us. So unfortunately, now we're just about out of time. So I want to again thank Irene Pritzker, president of the IDP Foundation, for sharing her perspective, as well as leading authors of the report, Arjun Upadhyay and Robert Francis, with support from Allison Rohner, who is the executive director of the IDP Rising Schools program. Thank you also to all the participants for taking the time to increase your understanding and engage with us through this question and answer session. And we will be sure to get to participants whose questions have not yet been answered, to try to continue and push forward this conversation, not just for this webinar, but beyond. So this is just a break, not the end, and I really appreciate everybody's engagement and hope you all have a wonderful day or evening depending on where you are. Thank you again and take care.